Welcome to the Pragmatic Hero's Journey, a monthly podcast about becoming a pragmatic author. Hosted by Tammy Corin and Tim Mitra. On this episode, Tim talks to Karl Stolley about his journey to becoming a pragmatic author. This episode was recorded on May 19, 2021. The Pragmatic Hero's Journey podcast is owned and operated by the Pragmatic Programmers, LLC, home of the Pragmatic Bookshelf. The Pragmatic Programmers, founded by Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, has one simple goal: to improve the lives of professional developers.
Yeah, so I don't know if Tammy told you, but she's not going to be able to make it.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah, so you're stuck with me.
I'm stuck with you.
My name's Tim. I don't know if Tammy told you that she has a co-host and sometimes on the main host, I guess.
Yeah, well, I've listened to I think every episode that's come out so far, so I feel like I know you,
cool.
which is
good.
which is super helpful.
Well, then on the other side of the coin, I've been following your blog, your website.
Yeah, sure.
Accelerate.dev. So I have a bit of interest in what you've been talking about, and actually I think that would be a good starting point. Let's what we normally do is we ask people to tell our listeners who you are and what you do.
Sure. Well, I'm Karl Stolley, Associate Professor of Information Technology and Management at Illinois Institute of Technology in Chicago. So I'm an academic. That's my day job, but I've been hacking basically since I was a kid without even realizing that was what I was doing. I was a DOS baby. Me and my little brother, when we were small, we would hack out on batch files and things like that. Eventually we started doing basics. So flash forward however many years, and now I'm sort of teaching primarily web development up and down the stack, and just having a great time with it. So
you hacking because your parents had a computer when you were a kid, or how did that work?
Yeah, my dad at the time was an employee of Zenith Electronics, and so our first computer was Zenith Data Systems, which I think was actually sold through Heathkit. I never quite understood what that corporate relationship was, yeah. But and we had built Heathkits, all growing up. My dad had an oscilloscope and some other kinds of things that, to the degree a 5 or 6 year old can help. My brother and I helped put those things together, and there was some assembly required on the computer that we first got. It was a 286, but it was more or less ready to go kind of at that point. But
so were you brandishing a soldering iron and all that, or?
I did learn to solder. My dad was very cautious about hot things and what my brother and I were allowed to touch. But yeah, I do have very distinct memories, mostly of the smell. Like once you've smelled solder, and particularly solder when you go to, wipe the tip of your soldering iron in that sponge, like that kind of steam, resin smell. Like I can tap into that memory just sitting here right now, even though I haven't thought about a soldering iron in a long time.
Yeah, you're right. I can do the same thing. So, but it's I think it's the flux that has the main order, right? So,
yeah, I think you're right.
Tell me about being an associate professor.
Yeah, that's part of the Byzantine levels of academic titles and things like that. You start off as an assistant professor, and then if you work hard and publish and do all those things, then you get promoted to associate, and then the next step for me would be to be promoted to what's called full professor. So, the job is more or less the same. It's just slightly different kinds of titles and standing and all that sort of academic trapping. I usually try to keep, like, my neighbors don't know. They know I'm a teacher, but I don't usually tell people that I'm a professor because they tend to assume that you're judging them and think that they're not smart. and I don't like to judge people. And I don't, for me, it's being an academic is kind of like a workplace hazard, or not really a workplace hazard. It's a life hazard. Like you just want to be the person that's like everybody else who, piles up the trash in the kitchen until it falls over and then you finally take it out. It's not some kind of highfalutin life of the mind all the time. That's a core part of your identity. But it is fun. It's good fun. It's rewarding, being able to, publish for a living and teach people for a living and teach actual grown-ups for a living. So, I mean, a lot of the students that I teach are graduate students. A lot of them are non-traditional students. So a lot of them are, either working at the time or they are, taking a break from work and coming back to do a graduate certificate or graduate degree. So it's just got a different kind of tenor, and it really makes me sort of up my own game in the classroom. I mean, I like teaching undergraduates too. They're great fun, but the mix is a really good population to work with. And as I've been with this particular program, we've seen more and more students sort of specializing in my area, which is web development. And so it's really fun to kind of be able to teach both introductory courses and help teach the sort of habits of mind of becoming a web developer, and then seeing those same students back in the classroom for more advanced classes that I teach, like the Web Rtc class that was actually the event that was in my life that led to the book that I'm writing for Prag.
Mm-hmm. Well, so notwithstanding the book, we'll talk about that in a minute.
Sure.
But you said to be an associate professor, you would have already had to have published, right? So what would you have published for that?
Mostly things that are kind of locked up in paywalled journals, lots of journal articles.
Oh, okay.
I do have one book that I wrote that has the absolute worst title of any book ever. It's called How to Design and Write Web Pages Today. And it's a lesson. It's a lesson in don't give a joking working title to a publisher because you think it's so bad, because then they needed a title. And so it's like, fine, it's How to Design and Write Web Pages. And there was a series that the first edition was in that was called Writing Today. So it was actually a book. I mean, it was a technical book, but it was written sort of for a non-technical audience of people, mostly writers. Anyway, they stuck today on the end of it. And so I have to live with that on my resume and be introduced with that as the title of the book. So just word of advice for anybody out there, be serious about your working titles, because one day you'll be sitting at your house and a box of books will show up and there's the actual title of it and you can't change it anymore.
Yeah, that's such an unfortunate title for software development too, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Because everything's at a point in time. And that's one big pet peeve of mine is the books become deprecated really quick, right? I mean, they're not that they're not useful, but the technology they talk about often does.
Right, they're snapshots. I mean, they really are.
Yeah.
They're what they are today, and the more that authors can be invested in whatever work it is that they're doing, over the longer term, the better it is for readers all around.
Right. So I'm primarily involved in mobile development these days, but I do still do a lot of web development myself. So can you explain to me and our listeners what Web Rtc is?
I sure can. It is...
In 25 words or less.
In 25 words or less. It is... here's me like trying to stuff my... to get too academic on it. But so WebRTC is a couple of different things. It is, at the lowest levels, it is a suite of protocols developed by the IETF, which is actually called RTC Web. And what I'm writing about is WebRTC, which is the browser-based implementation of a bunch of things, of which RTC Web from the IETF is one of them. And what it allows you to do is to connect any two pairs of browsers over the internet and stream data in real time. So most famously, that is audio and video data that would be coming off of your device's camera and microphone. But there's also a very low-level API in it that allows you to stream any kind of data that you want. So you can build everything from text-based chats to file transfers to, if you're doing games, you can stream, positional data, anything like that. And so, so the job of the web developer becomes, how do you build an interface around the exposed pieces of this API? And then, of course, the other thing, even though the WebRTC specification, which is housed at the W3C, even though that thing has been in development for over a decade now, it was just finally in January of this year that the spec hit like a full W3C recommendation status. But browsers, of course, are lagging in their implementation of what's actually in the spec. So you have to do quite a bit of work to make sure that, the very best browsers that are in circulation, and by very best, I mean, things that are 5, 6, 7 years old, that you're still able to make your WebRTC application accessible on this. So that's where a lot of the gymnastics is.
So I'm going to go out on a limb. Is that real-time collaboration?
Yeah, real-time communication. Sorry, I'm so deep into the acronyms, but yeah, real-time communication, web real-time communication.
We have TLAs for all our acronyms, by the way, on this show.
There we go.
I'm kidding. Yeah. So and when you started talking, it kind of reminded me of the old days, in the early days of sharing files, where you would hook one modem up to another over a phone line, and I would dump my code to you, and then you could run it, kind of thing. But I guess this is more like a Zoom call, but without having the middleman.
Yeah,
is that the idea?
Zoom would be a really good sort of metaphorical service. Now, of course, when you're on a Zoom call, Zoom has started to implement in their browser, which they really tried to discourage you from using Zoom in the browser. But if you were able to kind of machete your way through all the pop-ups and install the app and go here, they are actually implementing parts of WebRTC in their browser. They would prefer that you use the native app. But yeah, when you're using Zoom, your audio and video signals are going through a central server, and then they're being relayed on to another person, which, of course, that's the architecture that we're familiar with the web. Even if you look at something like WebSockets, that gives sort of a real-time persistent connection in the browser that lets you do certain things like send arbitrary data, that always requires a server to sort of sit in the middle. But with WebRTC, most of the time, and here is where we kind of get into lore areas, the lore is that 90% of the time you're able to connect one browser and another over the internet. And in that remaining 10%, which is usually some highly restrictive corporate firewall, government firewall, then you do have to actually have a fallback in the form of something that's called a turn server, which basically falls back and then relays your data through a third-party server onto the other browser. But most of the time, for most internet connections, we're able to establish that connection, even if you're behind a home firewall or something like that. So it's pretty remarkable technology.
So there's I'm missing the secret sauce here. I understood with the turn server,
Mm-hmm.
but how do you get the code? Like, do you upload a package of code to my browser, for instance, and then I'm able to communicate back and forth? Or
yeah, it doesn't even have to be that complex. We can, even in development, when you first get started, you could just test everything right on your local area network, and all that you're downloading, you're pointing your browser at a little server that's running on, your local host, and it's just delivering a little package of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just like any other website anywhere. And at least when you're talking over the local area network, that's all you need, is just that little bit of payload. And sort of, we can get into the sort of like the deeper mysteries of WebRTC, but one of the things that's really interesting about it is that you're delivering the same JavaScript to every browser that's connecting to the app. And so you've got purely symmetric code, but then what happens when you actually go to establish connections, you have to make peers asymmetric, and that gets deep into sort of like the internals of it. But there's nothing fancy about WebRTC. There's no plugin. There are certainly WebRTC libraries out there. I'm a big fan of, we've got these glorious APIs that are exposed in the browser. Let's learn them. And yeah, maybe in your shop or at your position, or to solve this particular problem, you need to bring a third-party library to it. I like to know the sort of root APIs. I like to just write whatever JavaScript is necessary to work with those things and keep, my footprint low, my payload that somebody has to download low, and just sort of work from there.
Right, that's pretty cool. So it's the JavaScript is sort of the secret sauce that's doing the making the network calls and transferring and receiving packets, right?
That's correct. Yeah, it's all sort of implemented just right in the browser, and there's an object. It's called RTC Peer Connection. It has shipped in just about every browser for at least the last 5 or 6 years, and that is basically like a little state machine. So it creates messages and receives messages, and your job as a web developer is to just handle those things and handle the state of that. And sort of the one caveat, like, this sounds great, right? Like, oh my God, no servers anymore. Well, you still need a server that's going to host the HTML, the CSS, and the JavaScript. And the other thing that you need is a server that is going to allow you to send signals back and forth as you're establishing a WebRTC connection. So it's very lightweight. It doesn't have to be complex. And in theory, you don't actually even need a server. Like, you could print out these different messages and rekey them. You'd have very high latency, but you would be able to establish a connection like that. So we do have a sort of a little out-of-band communication that has to happen. But once you've established that connection, and I love to demonstrate this in class. You can completely turn off your local development server, and the peer connection that you've created between two separate browsers just keeps right on ticking. They've got the information that they need to keep talking to each other.
They had no idea that browsers have this built-in capability, right?
I'm old enough to remember, when I was first getting into what I consider serious web development, which for me is a pretty low bar. The serious web development for me meant I stopped using Dreamweaver or Front Page or
Right.
earlier than that, Netscape Composer, and then actually started caring, what is the structure of my HTML? What is the, right sort of magical combination of CSS properties to achieve this effect I'm doing? And, for the longest time, it was just, most of being a web developer in the late 90s into the early 2000s was just dealing with Internet Explorer and the fact that everybody everywhere was using Internet Explorer, which was stuck at 6. I know. But, back then, the big, oh man, here's the Mount Everest you have to climb with web development. You've got to clear a float, right? Star hacker, and so to think that here we are 15 years after that, and we're talking about not just WebRTC, but all of the different kinds of APIs that we've got available in the browser now. It's really kind of astounding, and that we're just, the kind of plug-in hell that we were in for so long with, Flash, or just you need this proprietary browser plugin, or you need Silverlight, and you needed that stuff to do kind of anything that was interesting. And now, the web and the browsers that really are users' entry into it, it is a first-rate, legitimate development platform. And the trick for being developers in that now is to stay on top of these things, because there are so many that are coming online. I was just reading, I had no idea this API exists. There's a speech synthesis API. It being developed at the W3C. It's got partial implementation in several browsers, and that's going to do huge things for all kinds of different facets of web accessibility. And it might even spell that, some of these old CSS properties about voice family that we actually used back in the day to trick browsers. Now we might actually be able to use some of that stuff, sort of have these things built in. So it's really amazing.
Yeah, it's cool. I mean, it's funny that you mentioned your sort of start in web development was that way. I started web development I found a page one, web development 101, and it was literally open up a text editor and start creating HTML code. I didn't come to Dreamweaver till much later myself, but then I only was there for a couple of years, and now it's all WordPress and
right, so yeah. Well, if you're WordPress, that you're heroic. It's all the other I probably shouldn't name any of the products on the podcast, but they're advertised, Wix and Weebly and all these things that that are advertised every social media platform that you're on, and every family member that I think Karl does some kind of web thing. We should go talk to him about our candle business and whatever it is, and it's we built a Wix site. Can you help us? And it's not really. You're kind of beyond help a little bit. So if you're doing that platform, great. Have at it. That's not what I do, and I don't mean that in an elitist way, but it's just, well, we all have those little things, those little projects. I've got, I think, one WordPress site left in my life that is kind of just a service that I do for somebody. But yeah, it's and it's good to know about those things, but I think that the shift is always between what people, just and that's the weird thing about the web is that, everyone on the planet now, basically, who has electricity and a device has experienced the web in some way. And sort of the difference of being just a user of it, a regular person who just opens a web browser, it's enlightening to talk to friends and family that's their understanding of it, and see, how much those of us who do develop for the web, we're really insulated from that in ways that I think probably harm some of the ways that we come to doing interface design and a lot of other things, just the sort of mental picture that people have of how the web works.
Yeah, I think they think it's some sort of global television or galactic encyclopedia kind of thing,
Yeah.
It's where they go to check their friends and family videos and stuff, and go to Facebook and compose a tweet, but they don't really understand the sort of underpinnings like I do, sort of thing, right?
Right.
Having many, many things. So I do want to switch gears and talk a bit about your blog post here, which talks about this book deal that you're working on, your first book, I guess, for pragmatic programmers, right?
Yeah, I'm sitting here looking at a copy of the very first Pragmatic book I bought, which at the time I had no idea anything about Pragmatic. I was just learning Ruby, and so I got Programming Ruby 1.9, which is, of course, affectionately known as the pickaxe. And I think the second book I got was very shortly after that, which was Travis Swicegood's Pragmatic Version Control Using Git, which that book is what made me realize that Pragmatic was not just another run-of-the-mill tech publisher, but because that was the first one that I'd gotten both in electronic and print form, and actually, started like interacting with Travis. But prior to that, I knew version control was something I should be doing. And I'd poked a little bit at SVN. I was far enough out that like I didn't have to really worry about like CVS or anything like that. But I was, even the things that I did with CVS, like, oh my God, I got to check out this workspace. Like, what is all this stuff? And then, Subversion, it was like, well, this is kind of cool, but I got to have an internet connection all the time to do that. I don't know, because this was kind of, I think, late grad school when I first got into Travis's book. So I didn't have the world's greatest internet connection. I was just kind of a broke student. So like the idea of like, I gotta like it's more of the data. So it just never clicked. But then, and I couldn't. I tried to think about this. I don't really remember what it was particular that sort of like turned me on to Git and specifically pointed me to Travis's book. But it was a life-changing thing. It changed everything about how I develop, and it completely changed how I taught in the classroom. Because prior to that, it's like, oh, okay, you're building a website, make sure you post it to a server, or, God forbid you send it as a
zip file.
A zip file or something like that. And so it changed the way that I accepted assignments from students. It changed the way that I taught classes because, here I am like writing commits in class and would have students like on electronic discussion. And this is way before the pandemic. I've always had kind of like an electronic discussion component, but like students would take a commit URL from GitHub as a response to another student's question, like, oh yeah, Stolley did this here, like this is where this line changed or whatever. So at that point, then I was like, well, what else does this Pragmatic Press have? And so I just started reading especially in the web development Ruby areas. That was my introduction to Rails, which then within a couple of years I was teaching a class on Rails and using the Agile development book. And then along the way, I got to know Travis a little bit, and he was working on another book, and I reviewed for that one. And there was then another one I got contacted because I'd been, a pretty faithful reviewer for the press. I got contacted for Trevor Burnham's book on asynchronous JavaScript. He gave me like the world's nicest shout out in his acknowledgments because I had really kind of given him a lot of feedback on it. So, by that time I had written my first book, and it was like, man, I would really like to write for Pragmatic one day, but it has to be a good, worthy topic. Like, I don't want to just make something up or pitch something that I, could probably write the pitch for it, but do I actually want to live with that thing? And so, it went like that for probably 10 years or so of just like, reading lots of Prag books, being envious every time a new book came out, like, oh, I could have written that, but thank goodness this other person did, because now I don't have to. And then that brings me to this time about a year ago. I knew I was going to be teaching a class on WebRTC, and the first place I went was like, well, hopefully somebody at Pragmatic has kind of like slipped one past me, and there's this great WebRTC book, because I know the Pragmatic one will be the one to read. And sadly, there wasn't one. And then it became a kind of frantic search everywhere to try to find a book about WebRTC that was at least about the implementation as it stood once it got to candidate recommendation stage. And I think this is still the case, that the most recent books on WebRTC go back to like 2013, 2014, well before the specification was finished. And, most of them are happy to sort of wallow for, a good 8-9 chapters and sort of like the theoretical end of it, and don't really get you down to building anything until way late in the book. Probably the most famous book that's still in circulation, I think it's its penultimate chapter before you write a line of code. And you've done a lot of reading before then. So I kind of just went into full-blown panic mode, because I'm like, well, I don't really, I don't know how to cobble enough resources together and do everything, and how to sort of like teach students effectively if I don't have a book. So I just, in preparation for the class, I just spent the summer like working through material I could find, doing my own reading of the spec, poking at the browser, figuring out what was fact and what was fiction in terms of what had actually been implemented. And I taught the class. It was wildly successful. I'll be gross for just 1 second and say I won like an internal university teaching award for teaching that class.
Yeah, blow your own horn.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is like we were all online this year because of the pandemic, but there's probably no better topic to teach in a pandemic than WebRTC because everybody's at home. And so it was really fun kind of teaching the class. And once we got to the point where we were talking about sort of deploying WebRTC apps in the wild and things like that, was, while I'm teaching and broadcasting and recording class from my house, like trying to like convince students like, hey, would one of you want to like join this call? And so we kind of had this fantastic, very sort of meta experience where we're already like connected over Google Meet or whatever, and now here's this app I've built, and then there's my student kind of beaming in and being able to kind of see that thing right in action. So it was really perfectly timed, and there's no trial by fire quite like trying to teach a topic like that to a graduate course, because they really will needle you and ask the tough questions, the kinds of things that, even if you're really working over material well in your head because you're building something, man, leave it to a graduate student to like ask the question that just leaves you silent for a little bit. Then you have to say, I'm sorry, I will get back to you because I don't know the answer.
Yeah, I used to teach a course on iOS. It's totally parallel to what you're saying, because when I first started teaching, it was like there was nothing. There's a couple of books on Pragmatic and a few other publishers and stuff like that. And I think it's funny that you said that, because I just checked a couple of days ago. My first Pragmatic book was a book on iPad development back in 2010, and it was sort of, I think I got it in electronic format in a beta, and it was like, half the chapters weren't even written yet, sort of thing. Yeah, warms the cockles of my heart, and also, the same sort of survival skill of trying to, put together lesson plans for your students and not having something. And they all say, is there a book I can have? And you're like, no,
yeah,
unless I, like you're writing it, right?
Well, not until later. I mean, that was the funny thing, is like I taught this course, and then we had finals week, and then we were basically into the holidays at that point. And I'm a terrible person about relaxing. Like when I finish a semester, I'm like, still, I'm like the Coyote in the Roadrunner cartoons, like running out way past the end of the cliff. And my wife was just, she was like, you need to just relax. You've been, working too hard, because I'd had a couple of papers taken in the fall and so a few other projects I was working on. And she's like, you just need to take a day and like just like do nothing. So that was like maybe December 20th or something like that. And then the next day I took the day of relaxation, like begrudgingly like sat on the couch and did nothing. And then the next day I was kind of filing away stuff and archiving things from the WebRTC class. And I was like, man, this should be a book. Like, I've got all this research, I've got all this code, I've got all this everything. Like what is wrong with me? Why am I going to just like archive this and keep it in my own personal stash until the next time I teach? And so I went to work that day on a proposal, and I won't lie and say like I had Pragmatic in mind from the get-go, but as I worked up the proposal and started writing a sample chapter just to kind of prove to myself that I could do it. And I started with a difficult chapter because I knew that like if I could write that really difficult one, then the rest of the book would probably come together well. But yeah, like I wrote sort of a draft of the chapter, draft of the proposal over the holidays, and then my semester kicked up in like mid-January, something like that. And not long after it started, I sent the proposal off to Prag, and like a cold call. Like yes, I've reviewed for the press, but nobody knows who I am there. So I was just kind of like this random guy who sent a proposal into the little submissions email address, and I heard back like within a half an hour, which blew my mind, because that's not how academic publishing works at all. Like if you get a response from somebody ever, let alone within a month or a half an hour, then you're really doing something. So yeah, it was very exciting, and it all happened very quickly.
Cool. And so how's the writing? Where are you in the writing process? Have you gone to beta yet? And are you?
Oh, I'm still very early. I think I just signed the contract, I think, in mid-March. So what I'm preparing for right now is actually the 3-chapter, which is the point at which the publisher reviews it, my editor reviews it, it goes to production, they look at my images and all those kinds of things, and then basically, yeah, assuming everything goes well with that, then the book will actually move forward. Because my day job is being faculty, the last 4 weeks or so, I haven't generated a lot of new material on the book. I basically took the time to go back and kind of get myself completely reorganized in terms of how I was planning to ship the source code that would go with the book and keep it put together. But now, as of last Friday, I've submitted my final grades, and I'm off and running for the summer. So this is like my project for the summer. So I do expect to pick up the pace, and hopefully we'll be seeing a beta version of this book out. I'm hoping sometime in July, August at the latest, because I'd like to have the thing more or less drafted in full before classes start up again for me at the end of August.
And don't forget to take the odd day here and there and sit on the couch and do nothing, right?
Yeah, no, we've got my wife and we've just last night booked a cabin in the woods, literally.
Nice.
no TV, no internet, but they do allow dogs, so we can take our dog along with us. And
nice.
Yeah, we're gonna do that. I think here, actually, that'll be kind of like the reward, because if my plan goes, then we're recording this in May, so it'll be like May 31st-ish is when I'll go into the 3-chapter review. Knock on wood. And then yeah, we'll split right after that. Take about a week.
Sure. And so are you in the Chicago area, or are you living at the outskirts, or?
Yeah, I'm in Chicago proper. I live in a neighborhood called Logan Square, and
cool.
It's a hip, trendy little neighborhood. It's regrettably it's gentrifying. I mean, you can practically come with a lawn chair, sit in my neighborhood, and kind of watch it gentrify over the course of an afternoon. But I love living in the city. I grew up in the suburbs, actually, and the promise I made to myself was that if I ever returned to the Chicago area, that I would live in the city proper. And lo and behold, after I finished graduate school at Purdue in Indiana, I got the job at Illinois Tech and ended up moving back here. And this is home for me.
Cool. All right. So Tammy always likes to get into the tools that you would use. What's your platform of choice, and what do you do your writing in?
I used to be a simple person. It's kind of like kitchen knives. Like if you get serious about cooking, like when I was a bachelor, you come to my bachelor apartment, like, here's my knife, right?
Yeah.
And I use that to cut meat. I use that to slice apples. I use that to peel carrots, whatever. And I think once you get a little bit more, I mean, I've managed to basically not be much of a grown up, but I am grown up enough to have a nice set of kitchen knives. And so that's my metaphor for tools. Like over the course of any given work session, I will work in Vim. I will work in BB Edit, is where I do a lot of my writing. Although I got to tell you, I've
loved BB Edit. I've been using it for years.
Yeah. That's my ride or die. But at the same time, I have been using Atom a lot more in the last several years, partially because my students became such huge fans of it. And one of the things that I discovered while I was teaching is that, this isn't really discovery, it's like rediscovery. Like, especially when you're working with beginners, you just never know what little inconsistency or difference or thing that's not quite like what they're looking at is going to trip them up. And so it turned out they were all using Atom, and sort of to reduce the amount of cognitive dissonance in my class, I stopped using BB Edit and started using Atom. And so it became the browser that I would pull open, if students come for help during office hours or whatever. And there are certain things about it that I really like. So I tend to use that one a lot. For my actual writing, I usually like a devoted Markdown editor for that. These days, I tend to be a Mac and iOS user most of the time. I use a Markdown editor called Bear that I'm a big fan of. But I've got another one that's called IA Writer that is still kind of in the rotation for certain kinds of things. So, I think I'm a person who tries to be a creature of habit as much as possible, but then I get bored awfully fast. And so when it comes to something like writing a book, or writing a long, piece of source code, or working on something, like it's like a change of scenery. Like, yeah, I'm going to close Bigby Edit here, and I'm going to work in Atom for a little while. Or, you know what, I'm outside on the patio on my iPad, which has no, decent development editor, so I'm going to just use my SSH client on my iPad to talk to my computer upstairs, and I'm going to just hack this thing out on Vim on my iPad and, sip my latte and be a hipster who lives in Logan Square and SSHs back into his own house from the patio. There's lots to be said of just, changing up your environment. And one of the things that I like to teach students is, like, be a nomad. Like, be ready to, like, ditch your tools, whatever they are, ditch your framework, ditch your OS, ditch whatever it is at a moment's notice and be able to pick up. Because if you can do that, it means that what you've learned is sort of like a deeper knowledge that goes beyond, like, well, this is how, this piece of software does it, or that's where this is. It's like, if you can be independent and confident kind of in your knowledge of how things generally work, and you pick up and use a different editor, use a different, command line tool for what it is that you're doing, you'll be a much happier human, because then you won't be, completely lost when the day comes that your favorite tool, is no longer being shipped, or it's, the company behind it closes, or, whatever the horrible thing is that's going to happen, because ultimately it does happen.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's happened to me many times. But I was gonna ask if you had some sort of tool you were syncing between your iPad and your Mac, but I guess you're doing SSH into your own innards, as it were, right?
Yeah,
so that's cool.
Yeah, and using like bare syncs between devices or whatever, and it does the job well enough. So yeah, I mean, you can never have too many redundant backups.
Yeah, our house is full of computers. I'm a Mac collector, so
excellent.
Yeah, and I VNC into everything. Like, I have a bunch of headless Macs here that I use all the time, and
that's awesome.
For different reasons. Yeah. I'm actually staring at 3 screens right now, which are 3 different computers.
Nice.
Yeah. So as you know, Karl, from having listened to the show, we have a section of the show where we ask our guests some questions. And if you're ready for that, I can start digging into those. Right?
I am ready.
All right. So who or what was influential in your career?
Oh, that's really tricky. I had so many influences along the way, but I will name somebody who was actually a professor of mine when I was an undergraduate. Her name is Nancy DeJoy. She's now faculty at Michigan State University, and she's like the furthest thing from a computer person ever. Like, she was actually a writing professor of mine. But she taught me how to think in ways that I didn't know how to think before, and she really taught me how to write, and was completely, a like a writing companion through grad school, and even when I was, writing articles and conference things that were about sort of technical subject matter, I would keep returning to her and sort of like getting her feedback on it, and that was formative, because I really learned like the earliest sort of technical writing that I did about development and these kinds of things were not for an audience of fellow developers. They were for people that were doing other kinds of things that I thought would really benefit from knowing, like, this is how, aspects of the web work or whatever. And so Nancy became sort of like the person that I would write to. I mean, even to this day, like when I was working on the proposal for the book, like she read it, but as I was writing it, like, she was the person that I was kind of thinking, like, if I can write this thing about this really technical subject that even a lot of web developers don't really know about, like, if I can write it for Nancy, who's a brilliant person, by the way. I do not mean to insult her intelligence. It's just like her area of specialization is like writing theory and things like that. But if I can communicate this idea to her and be understood, then I'm going to be fine. And that's kind of been the touchstone for my entire career. Nice.
Okay, cool. So we may have touched on this already, but what is your favorite programming language?
Oh, my favorite, like the one where I'm most at home and kind of love to rub my hands together at my own cleverness, is definitely Ruby. But these days I've been just pretty much all JavaScript all the time. I've gotten a lot deeper into Node. I've been writing more command line utilities in JavaScript using Node. So yeah, there's my like hedged answer.
Cool. All right. We already talked about your favorite text editor and IDE, but yeah, okay, we'll skip that one. So if you could choose another profession other than being an associate professor or a book writer, what would it be?
I would want to be a meteorologist. Like I'm a total geek about the weather. I run a little weather station in my backyard. My wife has taken to giving me as gifts like old school style weather instruments. Like I've got this thermometer that has like these bubbles of blown glass with liquid in them, and they rise and fall based on the temperature. And she just gave me a little globe that's a barometer that you fill with water, and you just basically trap a bubble of air in it, and then it has this little glass pipe that goes up the side, and as the pressure changes, the water level changes. And I'm the kind of person, like, morning routine is make my coffee, and then I go to the National Weather Service and glance at like the day's forecast, but then what I really kind of like lose myself in are like the technical forecast discussions that they write every single day that talk about frontogenesis and all these great sort of mouthful weather terms. And yeah, I'm always keenly aware of the weather. I love the weather, and I kind of wish that my knowledge of it, I mean, I'm an amateur in all regards with what I do know about the weather, but I think it would be really fun to go and do a degree in that, and to work for the National Weather Service. I don't think I've got a face or a personality for like TV to be like a TV weather person, but
you could be a radio guy.
But yeah, maybe like a weather on the radio kind of person,
radio,
something
right?
like that. Yeah, for sure.
All right. Okay, cool. So these some this or that questions. Do you prefer to work alone or work with a team?
I prefer a team, but I often find myself working alone.
Right. Okay. Book or ebook?
Oh, this is, yeah. I was afraid you were going to ask this one because I've heard you ask other people this one, and to me, it's so situational. If I have to pick one and the other goes away, then I'm going to go with paper book, and that's only because my library is stocked with tons of titles from graphic design, from typography, and I live for the day when we're going to have an ebook format that can actually do not just like, oh, that text is nice and legible, but like, oh wow, they did something really avant-garde with the typography. And what few design books I've ventured to try to buy as like a Kindle book or an EPUB, or God forbid, like even a PDF, like they don't hold up. And so yeah, I guess I would have to come down on the paper book side, but just because of like typography and design books.
Well, it's also the idea of laying it flat on the couch beside you and kind of knowing what side of the page the thing was on that you saw, or how deep into the book.
Yeah,
right?
No, that is really critical.
Completely lost on ebooks. I mean, I'm converted to ebooks,
Yeah.
But I think, like I said, Prague was probably my first ebook, but or one of the first ones. But
well, it's not even like the place that you can find. It's where you're reading along in the ebook, and then you are tempted, and then you click a reference that takes you somewhere else in the book. And then you read a few pages, and then you click again, and then suddenly you're like, "Where the heck was I just reading?" Because like all e-readers that I've seen can really take a page from like web browsers in terms of being able to hit the back button all the way back to where you're going. So it's not even about like finding a place I knew I was, a week ago. It was like finding the place I was 35 seconds ago.
Right, like a history stream or whatever. Right. Cool. All right. Form or function?
I'm going to be unconventional, I think, and I'm going to say form. I think people tend to approach this like, well, if you don't have function, then why would we even talk about form? But I look at form as an articulation of how much you care about the function to begin with. It's almost that kind of, apocryphal Steve Jobs kind of like looking at the back of the cabinet, when he's in a furniture store with Johnny Ive or something like that. But it's like, take it just writing lines of code. Like, yeah, my first stabs at any kind of method or function definition or something like that. Like, they do the thing, right? They take the input and they make the output and everything's fine. But the expression of that is so graceless. And yeah, it would be okay. And yeah, nobody was probably ever going to see this on this particular thing, but I'm going to see it. And so I want to, remember that when I'm writing code, I'm writing code at least for my future self, who's going to probably come back to this thing at some point. And if I'm lucky enough, I am in a team setting where other people are going to have to look at this code, and I want it to be at least sensible. And so, it's I think, a rarer experience to see really elegantly written code that does not function properly. It is very common to see poorly written code that does not function properly, or only functions properly under exactly the right circumstances. So yeah, I'm going to go with form as like a marker of like the care that went into the function behind.
Cool. All right. Next question: pencil or pen?
Pen, all the way. Like I'm looking at the 4, what are called pencil cups on my desk, and there's not a pencil. Closest that comes to it is an Apple Pencil. And that being said, I've got my little islands of different pens that I really like, because to me it's like it's the feel of the instrument on the paper, and it's also kind of like a weapon against my own indecisiveness. If I have an eraser, I'll never get anything done because I will be constantly kind of refining. So I would rather kind of like make the stroke, write the word, and then just cross the whole thing out later and then rewrite it, than to kind of like use an eraser and make all that mess all over the place.
Oh, okay. I don't remember asking about erasers, but that's okay. I'm kidding. Okay, so Star Wars or Star Trek? Or is there something else?
There is Star Wars, and that's kind of where it begins and ends with me. I appreciate Star Trek. I like Star Trek. I watch Star Trek. I've had roommates over the years who were huge Star Trek fans. So, but Star Wars is like my thing. Like, you can't see me, nobody can right now, but I'm wearing my T-shirt that's like my favorite pandemic purchase, which is the targeting graphic from the Death Star in Episode 4. And I've got a huge, like, oversized Mandalorian Funko Pop dude holding the Baby Yoda behind me just over my shoulder, including also a new find, which is like this set of Jedi texts that supposedly Luke Skywalker found. So yeah, I'm a little bit into Star Wars, and to me, part of it is that like I can attach so much more of my life to Star Wars and like crazy things happening. I'll give you like one silly story that you didn't ask for, which was when I went to go see Episode 3 when I was in graduate school. It was in this theater in Lafayette, Indiana, and we actually made the national news because like 20 minutes from the end of Episode 3, just as Yoda and Obi-Wan were entering the Jedi Temple, the bulb burned out on the projector. And so we're sitting in the audience, and like suddenly like you can hear the audio, but it gets really dark. I'm like, wow, George Lucas, this is a really interesting cinematic choice that we can't see anything. And then I can't remember exactly what happened. In my memory, there was like the winding down of the tape sound of like the audio going brr, 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 brr. And then the house lights come up, and then this poor man, because this was like a midnight showing of Episode 3, and like this poor manager has to come out
like on the first day
like, yeah, this was like we had waited out to see the midnight showing, so it's early in the morning, the film has just ended, the lights have come up, this poor pasty manager comes out to this room of just livid nerds who are like, what is happening? And then we get explained to us that, because obviously this was still a print, this wasn't a digital projection, that there's no way for them to like rewind the movie and start it and fix the bulb, and so we will all get vouchers to come back and see it tomorrow. And like, again, this is 20 minutes from the end of the movie, and so this poor guy is like, I'll be in the party room if anybody wants to talk with me about this. And so I'm sure that people took him up on the offer, but it was like this incredible, and it literally was in the news the next day, like a national news, like USA Today ran a story about the bulb burning out at the thing. So yeah, big Star Wars.
That's funny. Same thing happened to us with Force Awakens, because my son and I, we do a sci-fi podcast, and we always go to the first runs of these things, mm-hmm. and same deal. I think we were there midnight show, whatever, on the first night, and the scene where Rey's going down the stairs and she's just about to find the lightsaber. Mm-hmm. A digital copy, but all of a sudden it just froze, right? And next thing, and like the whole audience just erupted, and they didn't. Fortunately, it was digital, so they were able to rewind the DVD and get it. And we got the vouchers. I still have the vouchers upstairs. I can't really cash them in for anything because they're kind of useless. But
right.
Yeah, it's fun. But I don't know. But like for us, we have to buy our tickets well in advance to get on a first night showing these days. Well, not anymore, I guess. Big deal. Now we're just sitting on our couch at home watching stuff, right?
Oh yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
And that was the one advantage of like being out in the country for graduate school, is that like stuff like bands would come to town, and I'd be like jockeying for position, and then you could still get tickets the day of. And it was the same way with Star Wars. Like, I mean, we did buy those tickets in advance, but it wasn't like a true triumph there to like get first night tickets for something.
Well, I think for episode 3 we were lining up still, like that's long ago, right? So now it's long ago and disappointing, but
right.
Yeah. All right, so we're at the end of our thing. So I guess before we go, can you tell people how they can get in touch with you and where they can ask questions and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. My blog is at stolley.dev, STOLLEY.dev, and I run sort of my professional portfolio site at stolley.co. So if you Google for Stolley and Karl with a K, you're probably likely to find me, and it's got links there for my LinkedIn, my Twitter, and a few other things where you can find me. But yeah, please, I love getting to meet people and talking about stuff. So yeah, reach out. I tend to be a fairly friendly person and try not to ignore anybody, at least not intentional.
Cool. All right. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Pragmatic Hero's Journey. You can find us on the web at pragprog.com. We're also on Twitter and Facebook as pragprog. If you enjoy the podcast, please consider writing a review on iTunes, sharing a link on social media. Go ahead, tell the world we're out there. You can also send us feedback and guest requests to pragtalk@pragprog.com. And finally, if you like listening to the show and want to know how you can help, please visit our website at pragprog.com for details. And that's it. That wraps it up. Tim.
Hey,
so I'm staring. I should got to just tell you before we wrap up.
Sure.
Here. Over there, I have a stormtrooper helmet. I made one out of paper mache when I was in grade. I was 17 when the first movie came out.
Oh, that's awesome.
And I have a 3D printed Millennium Falcon just across from my computer there. So
that's even better. Yep. That's great.
Yeah. I make my own toys now.
That's the way to do it. A lot cheaper that way as well.
Yeah, for sure.
Or I suppose within reason, right?
Well, I make things for around the house too. Like we have like an air conditioning unit, and I made some things to hold the window because they're not designed for double hung windows. And what I print? Oh, I had to fix an IKEA shelf, so I had to print a piece to hold the bottom to hold it up, kind of thing. So yeah, and I fixed my Roomba gear by printing a gear for it. All kinds of stuff.
That's really
lots
cool.
of fun.
Yeah, I aspire to own a 3D printer, but I've got to work on my wife allowing me to get a drone first, and then maybe I can work up to a 3D printer once I get the drone.
Well, you know what you do? You get a 3D printer and you
print a drone. Yeah, that's even better.
Thanks for listening to the Pragmatic Hero's Journey. We hope you enjoyed the show. For more information about the Pragmatic Hero's Journey, please visit pragprog.com or send an email to pragtalk@pragprog.com.